The crystal-clear water of the infinity pool turned crimson as Margaret Green pulled the lifeless body of Thomas Harrington to the surface. His lips were blue, his eyes rolled back, and for a terrifying moment, she thought she was too late. "Mr. Harrington. Can you hear me?" Margaret's voice echoed across the sprawling Silicon Valley estate as she dragged the tech CEO's body onto the pool deck. Water cascaded from his designer suit, pooling around the Italian marble tiles that cost more than most people's cars. Margaret had been cleaning the Harrington mansion for 3 years, moving through its 43 rooms like a ghost. She preferred it that way, invisible, unnoticed, just another piece of the expensive furniture. But right now, invisibility was the last thing on her mind. Come on," she whispered, positioning her hands on Thomas's chest. The muscle memory kicked in instantly, 30 compressions, 2 breaths, repeat. Her fingers found the familiar rhythm she'd practiced thousands of times during her decade as a paramedic, before everything fell apart. Little did Thomas know that his quiet, unassuming housekeeper held the key to saving his life. As she worked, counting under her breath, Margaret's eyes caught something that made her freeze mid-compression. There, on Thomas's left forearm, partially obscured by his rolled-up sleeve, was a tattoo she'd never noticed before. A small, intricate design of intertwined medical symbols, a caduceus wrapped around a broken heart. Her hands trembled as the memory crashed over her like a tidal wave. 10 years ago. St. Mary's Hospital. The screaming. The blood. That same tattoo on another man's arm as she'd fought desperately to save a life that slipped away despite her best efforts. "No," she breathed, her professional composure cracking. "It can't be." But there it was, identical down to the smallest detail. The tattoo that had haunted her nightmares, that had driven her from medicine into a life of quiet service, was staring back at her from the arm of the man whose life now hung in her hands. Margaret's training warred with her trauma. Every instinct screamed at her to continue CPR, but her body had gone rigid. Thomas's face was growing bluer by the second, and still she couldn't move. The weight of recognition pressed down on her chest like a stone. "What are you doing to yourself, Tommy?" she whispered to the unconscious man, using a nickname she didn't even realize she knew. But what happened next shocked everyone, including Margaret herself. Something deeper than memory, stronger than fear, took control. Her hands resumed their life-saving rhythm as if guided by a force beyond her understanding. This decision would change everything between them, though she couldn't know it yet. "Come back," she commanded, pressing harder against his sternum. "You don't get to die on me. Not like this. Not when there's so much left unsaid." Thomas's body convulsed suddenly, water erupting from his lungs as he gasped back to consciousness. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and desperate, searching for something to anchor him to the world of the living. "Margaret," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of her own ragged breathing. "Is that really you?" The way he said her name sent ice through her veins. Not like an employer addressing his help, but like someone who'd been searching for her, someone who knew exactly who she was and what she'd been running from all these years. As sirens wailed in the distance, someone must have called 911. Margaret noticed Thomas's silk bathrobe crumpled beside the pool. Something white protruded from its pocket, something that definitely hadn't been there when she'd started her shift that morning. With shaking hands, she reached for the envelope, and her blood turned to ice when she saw her full name written across it in Thomas's distinctive handwriting: Margaret Elizabeth Green, former paramedic, badge number 2847. But the real shock was still coming, because as she clutched that envelope to her chest, Margaret realized that Thomas Harrington hadn't just happened to drown in his pool on the day she was working. He had been waiting for her. Margaret's hands trembled as she stared at the tattoo on Thomas's arm, a small, intricate compass rose with the initials EM beneath it. The world around her seemed to slow as memories crashed over her like a devastating wave. * Emergency medical. Engine 847 *. The numbers burned in her mind as she continued chest compressions, but her focus wavered. That tattoo wasn't just any design, it was identical to the one worn by the driver who had changed everything 10 years ago. "Come on, Thomas," she whispered urgently, pushing harder against his chest. Don't you dare die on me now. But her mind was already racing backward, pulling her into that sterile hospital corridor where her life had shattered. She could smell the antiseptic, hear the urgent beeping of machines, feel the crushing weight of the doctor's words echoing in her ears. Asterisk, your daughter didn't make it. The driver of the other vehicle, he survived, asterisk. Margaret's rhythm faltered for just a moment as the memory hit her full force. Emma. Her beautiful 8-year-old Emma, who loved butterflies and wanted to be a doctor just like Mommy. Gone because of a drunk driver who walked away with nothing more than a scar and a guilty conscience. Thomas gasped suddenly, water spurting from his lungs as his eyes fluttered open. Margaret immediately rolled him onto his side, her training overriding the emotional chaos in her mind. Easy, easy, she said, though her voice carried an edge she couldn't hide. Just breathe. Help is coming. Thomas looked up at her with confused, grateful eyes. Margaret? What happened? She studied his face, searching for any recognition, any sign that he knew who she really was. But there was nothing, just the bewildered expression of a man who'd nearly drowned. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder, but Margaret's attention was drawn to Thomas's silk bathrobe lying crumpled beside the pool. Something white protruded from the pocket, an envelope that seemed oddly out of place. The paramedics will be here any second, she said, reaching for the envelope almost without thinking. Her heart nearly stopped when she saw her name written across it in careful handwriting. Margaret Green, please read. How does he know my real last name? She'd been going by Margaret Washington since she started working for the Harringtons 6 months ago, a small deception she used to protect her privacy. But this envelope bore her maiden name, the name she'd carried when Emma was alive. Thomas was trying to sit up now, coughing and disoriented. Margaret, I need to tell you something. I've been meaning to. Shoo, she said quickly, slipping the envelope into her apron pocket as the EMTs burst through the back gate. Save your strength. The next few minutes were a whirlwind of activity. The paramedics took over Thomas's care while Margaret stepped back, her mind reeling. She watched them load him onto a stretcher, her hand unconsciously pressed against the envelope in her pocket. What could Thomas Harrington possibly have to say to her? And why did he have that tattoo, the same one she'd seen in police photos from the accident report she'd obsessed over for months after Emma's death? As the ambulance pulled away, Margaret found herself standing alone by the pool, the weight of the envelope feeling heavier than it should. She looked down at the water, now still and deceptively peaceful, and made a decision that would change everything. She had to know the truth. Later that evening, Margaret sat in her small apartment, the envelope unopened on her kitchen table. She'd been staring at it for over an hour, afraid of what she might find inside. Outside, rain began to patter against her window, matching the storm brewing in her heart. Finally, with shaking hands, she tore open the seal. Inside was a single sheet of expensive letterhead and a small photograph that made her gasp out loud. The photo showed a young man in a hospital bed, bandaged and broken, tears streaming down his face as he stared at something off camera. On the back, someone had written, "The day I learned her name was Emma." Margaret's hands shook as she unfolded the letter, Thomas's neat handwriting swimming before her eyes as she read the opening lines. Asterisk Margaret, if you're reading this, then fate has brought us together in a way I never expected. I've been trying to find the courage to tell you who I really am, asterisk. Just as she reached the second paragraph, a sharp knock at her door made her jump. Through the peephole, she could see an elegant woman with perfectly styled blonde hair, clutching a designer purse and looking deeply troubled. Victoria Harrington stood on her doorstep, and she was crying. Margaret's hands trembled as she stared at the envelope bearing her name in Thomas's familiar handwriting. The ambulance sirens had faded into the distance hours ago, leaving her alone in her modest one-bedroom apartment with questions that threatened to consume her sanity. The fluorescent kitchen light buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the cream-colored paper as she finally tore it open. The letter was brief, but every word hit her like a physical blow. Asterisk Margaret, I know you must hate me for what happened 10 years ago. I've carried the weight of that night every single day since. I tried to find you after the trial ended, but you'd disappeared. I understand why. I need to tell you the truth about what really happened to your brother David in that emergency room. There are things you don't know, things that might change everything. I've been looking for a way to make this right. We need to talk. Thomas *. Margaret sank into her worn leather chair, the same one she'd bought with her last paramedic paycheck before everything fell apart. David's face flashed in her memory, her younger brother, barely 22, full of dreams about becoming an engineer. The night that changed everything. No, she whispered to the empty room. I can't do this again. But even as she said it, questions flooded her mind. What truth was Thomas talking about? What didn't she know about that horrific night when David died on her watch in the ER? She'd blamed herself for years, convinced that her split-second decisions had cost her brother his life. The medical board's investigation had cleared her of wrongdoing, but the guilt had eaten her alive anyway. She reached for her phone, then stopped. Thomas was probably still unconscious in the hospital. But the letter suggested he'd been planning to contact her anyway. Had finding her working as his maid been pure coincidence, or had he orchestrated it somehow? Margaret stood and walked to her bedroom closet, pushing aside old uniforms and forgotten clothes until she found the cardboard box she'd hidden in the back corner. Inside were newspaper clippings from the trial, medical records, and photographs from her old life. Her hands shook as she pulled out a photo of herself and David at his college graduation, both of them grinning broadly. What really happened to you, baby brother? She whispered to the picture. The sound of footsteps on the apartment stairs made her freeze. She wasn't expecting anyone, and her few neighbors rarely made social calls. The footsteps stopped directly outside her door, followed by 3 sharp knocks. Margaret quickly shoved the letter and photo back into the box, her heart racing. Through the peephole, she saw a woman in an expensive navy pantsuit, perfectly styled blonde hair, and designer heels that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly rent. She recognized her immediately, Victoria Harrington, Thomas's wife. Margaret's blood ran cold. How had Victoria found her apartment? And why was she here now, of all times? Another sharp knock echoed through the small space. Margaret Green? I know you're in there. We need to talk. Margaret's mind raced. Victoria's tone was strangely calm, almost businesslike, which somehow made her presence even more unsettling. She could pretend not to be home, but Victoria clearly knew she was there. There was no avoiding this conversation. Taking a deep breath, Margaret opened the door, keeping the chain lock engaged. Mrs. Harrington. How did you find my address? Victoria's perfectly made-up face showed no emotion. May I come in? I think you'll want to hear what I have to say privately. I'm not sure that's a good idea. Your husband just had a medical emergency, you should be at the hospital with him. Thomas is stable and resting. The doctors say he'll make a full recovery thanks to your quick thinking. Victoria paused, her blue eyes studying Margaret intently. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because I found something in Thomas's study this morning while gathering his things for the hospital. Something about you and your brother David. The world seemed to tilt beneath Margaret's feet. Victoria knew about David? How much did Thomas's wife know about their shared history? I don't know what you're talking about, Margaret said weakly, but her voice betrayed her. Victoria reached into her purse and pulled out a manila folder. Margaret, I know my husband hired you specifically because of who you are. I know about the lawsuit, the medical malpractice case, everything. And I know about the evidence that was never presented at trial. Margaret's knees nearly buckled. What evidence? Victoria's expression softened slightly, showing the first hint of genuine emotion. The evidence that proves you weren't responsible for your brother's death. The evidence that proves someone else made the decision that killed him. She paused, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. And I know who that person was, Margaret. I think you deserve to know the truth about what really happened that night. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room flickered as Thomas's eyes slowly opened, his vision blurry and disoriented. The steady beep of monitors filled the silence, and Margaret stood at the foot of his bed, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. She'd been waiting for this moment for 3 hours. "You're awake," Margaret said, her voice steady but cold. Thomas tried to sit up, wincing as the four tugged at his arm. "Margaret? What happened?" His voice was hoarse, confused. "I remember being in the pool, then everything went black." "You nearly drowned," she replied, stepping closer. "But you know that's not why I'm here." Thomas's eyes focused on her face, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition. Fear. "The letter," Margaret continued, pulling the crumpled envelope from her purse. "You had this in your robe pocket. With my name on it." But before Thomas could respond, the hospital room door burst open. Dr. Martinez entered first, followed by a swarm of reporters pushing cameras and microphones forward. Behind them, Thomas's wife Elena rushed in, her designer heels clicking against the linoleum floor. "Mr. Harrington, can you comment on the circumstances of your accident? Is it true your employee saved your life?" "Elena, please, get them out," Thomas whispered, trying to shield his face. Security guards pushed the media back while Elena grabbed Margaret's arm. "What are you still doing here? Shouldn't you be at home?" Her tone carried barely concealed suspicion. Margaret looked directly at Thomas. "We need to talk. Alone." Elena's grip tightened. "I don't think that's appropriate. Thomas needs rest, and frankly, I have questions about how this happened in the first place." The tension in the room was suffocating. Thomas watched Margaret's face, seeing the determination there, the pain she'd carried for so long. He knew this conversation was inevitable. "Elena, please. Give us a few minutes," Thomas said quietly. "Absolutely not. I'm your wife, Thomas. If there's something to discuss, I should." 10 minutes, Margaret interrupted, her voice cutting through Elena's protests. "That's all I need." Elena looked between them, sensing an undercurrent she couldn't understand. "Fine. 10 minutes. But I'll be right outside." She shot Margaret a warning look before leaving, closing the door behind her. The room fell silent except for the persistent beeping of the heart monitor. Margaret moved closer to Thomas's bedside, the letter still clutched in her hand. "April 15, 2014, she began, her voice trembling. "St. Mary's Hospital. Emergency room. Do you remember?" Thomas closed his eyes, his face contorting with pain that had nothing to do with his physical condition. "Every day. My daughter was in that ambulance," Margaret continued, tears beginning to form. "Sarah. She was only 8 years old. Hit by a drunk driver on her way home from school." "Margaret, please." "No." Her voice cracked. "You don't get to stop me now. Not after 10 years. Not after I saved your life today." She pulled the letter from the envelope with shaking hands. "You wrote that you've been trying to find me. That you wanted to make things right. But how do you make right the fact that your company's software glitch delayed that ambulance by 12 minutes? Thomas's heart monitor began beeping faster. The weight of her words, the accusation he'd carried for a decade, crashed down on him. The GPS system failed. Our emergency dispatch software, it routed them to the wrong address first. 12 minutes, Margaret repeated, her voice breaking. 12 minutes that might have saved her life. "I know," Thomas whispered, tears streaming down his face. "God help me, I know." The door suddenly opened again, and Dr. Martinez peered in, concerned by the erratic beeping from Thomas's monitor. "Is everything all right in here?" Margaret wiped her eyes quickly. "We're fine." As the doctor retreated, Thomas reached toward Margaret with a trembling hand. "There's something else you need to know," he said, his voice barely audible. "Something about that night that changes everything. About why I was really looking for you." Margaret's breath caught. After all these years, after all the pain and anger she'd carried, there was more? "What are you talking about?" Thomas looked directly into her eyes, his own filled with a mixture of anguish and desperate hope. "The accident report, there were things that were never made public. Things about the other driver that night that connect to both of us in ways you can't imagine. The sterile hospital room hums quietly with the steady beep of monitors, a stark contrast to the chaos that erupted just hours earlier. Thomas sits upright in his bed, his face pale but determined, while Margaret stands by the window overlooking the parking lot where news vans are finally beginning to disperse. The reporters are leaving, Margaret observes, her voice barely above a whisper. She turns to face him, still processing everything that has unfolded. Your wife went home to get you some clothes. Thomas nods, his fingers nervously playing with the hospital bracelet around his wrist. Margaret, I need you to know that finding you, it wasn't an accident. I've been looking for you for 10 years. She crosses her arms, maintaining her distance. The letter made that clear. What I don't understand is why now? Why go through such elaborate measures instead of just knocking on my door? He takes a shaky breath, his eyes glistening. Because I was a coward. Because every time I tried to approach you directly, I couldn't find the words to undo what I'd done. Thomas reaches toward his bedside table, retrieving a small, weathered photograph. Do you remember this day? Margaret's breath catches as she recognizes the image. It's from the hospital where she used to work, a group photo of the emergency medical team celebrating their unit's anniversary. She's standing in the back row, beaming with pride in her paramedic uniform, while Thomas is barely visible in the corner, a young hospital administrator she'd barely noticed at the time. You were there that night, she whispers, the memory crystallizing with painful clarity. The night of the accident. The budget meeting. Thomas's voice breaks as he speaks. I was the one who recommended the staffing cuts. I was young, ambitious, trying to make a name for myself in hospital administration. I thought I knew better than the veteran staff. I pushed for reduced overnight crews, convinced the board it would save money without compromising patient care. Margaret sinks into the chair beside his bed, her legs suddenly unable to support her. There weren't enough paramedics on duty that night. When the pileup happened on Highway 101, we were stretched too thin. And you took the extra calls, Thomas continues, tears now streaming down his face. You worked a triple shift because of my cuts. You were exhausted when you responded to that final call, the one where I made the mistake that ended my career, Margaret finishes, her own eyes filling with tears. The patient I couldn't save because I was too tired to think straight. The family that sued. The investigation that found me at fault. Thomas reaches out tentatively, and after a moment's hesitation, Margaret takes his hand. It wasn't your fault, Margaret. It was mine. I destroyed your career with my arrogance and inexperience. I've carried that guilt every single day since then. The room falls silent except for the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. Margaret stares at their joined hands, processing a decade of anger and self-blame that suddenly has a different target. I built my company with the money I inherited from my family, Thomas continues. Every success, every achievement felt hollow because I knew it was built on the ruins of your destroyed dreams. When I started looking for you 5 years ago, I discovered you were working as a maid. A paramedic with 10 years of experience, reduced to cleaning houses because of my decision. Margaret looks up at him, seeing not the powerful CEO she'd known him as, but a broken man carrying enormous guilt. The envelope, you were trying to tell me? I've been trying to find the courage for months. I hired the cleaning service specifically because I knew you worked for them. I kept hoping for the right moment to explain, to apologize, to try to make amends somehow. He squeezes her hand gently. I never imagined it would happen like this, with me nearly drowning and you saving my life with the very skills I helped destroy your career over. A bitter laugh escapes Margaret's lips. The irony isn't lost on me. After all these years of wondering what went wrong, of blaming myself for that patient's death. You were never the problem, Margaret. You were an exceptional paramedic who was pushed beyond human limits because of my thoughtless cost-cutting. The patient's death wasn't your fault, it was the inevitable result of running medical staff into the ground. Margaret wipes her eyes with her free hand, feeling a weight she's carried for a decade beginning to lift. What happens now, Thomas? What do you want from me? Nothing, he says firmly. I want to give you everything you lost. I've already spoken with my lawyers. There's a fund set up in your name, enough to complete your medical recertification, to go back to school if you want, to start over completely. No strings attached. She shakes her head slowly. I can't just take your money. It's not my money, Margaret. It's what I owe you. It's 10 years of lost wages, lost dreams, lost confidence. It's the life you should have been living if I hadn't made that devastating decision. Margaret stands and walks back to the window, watching the last of the news vans disappear around the corner. For the first time in years, she feels something she'd almost forgotten: hope. I don't know if I can forgive you, she says honestly, not turning around. Not yet. But I understand now that the person I really need to forgive is myself. When she turns back, Thomas is nodding, his expression peaceful despite the tears. That's all I can ask for. The chance for both of us to finally let go of the past and move forward. Margaret approaches the bed one more time, looking down at the man whose life she saved and who, in return, had given her back her own. I'll consider your offer, Thomas. Not because I think you can buy forgiveness, but because maybe we both deserve a second chance. As she heads toward the door, Thomas calls out softly, Margaret? Thank you. For saving my life today, and for not letting the past destroy your compassion completely. She pauses at the threshold, her hand on the door handle. Sometimes the biggest act of courage isn't saving a stranger's life, it's finding the strength to let go of anger and choose hope instead. Walking out into the hospital corridor, Margaret feels lighter than she has in years. The future remains uncertain, but for the first time in a decade, it feels full of possibility rather than haunted by regret.